One subway ride, one small gesture, and the world changed. How Steph Curry's simple act of kindness sparked a wave of stories, hope, and connection that no one saw coming. The subway car was packed as usual. It was a busy afternoon, with people rushing to get to their next stop, some lost in their thoughts, others glued to their phones. The typical hum of the train was filled with the sounds of the passengers' movements. People were standing, leaning against the poles, or sitting, trying to make the most of the ride. It was a normal day, somewhere in a bustling city like San Francisco or Boston, where public transportation is never quiet, always alive with different faces. Among the sea of commuters was an elderly woman standing by the door. She was gripping the overhead rail tightly with both hands, trying her best to keep her balance as the train swayed and jerked with every turn. Her face showed signs of exhaustion, the kind of tiredness that only years of life could bring. She struggled with each movement of the train, trying not to stumble. The crowd around her seemed oblivious to her struggle, absorbed in their own world of phones, books, and daydreams. She looked out the window, her tired eyes reflecting the weariness of the day, but she didn't ask for help. She just stood there, trying to hold herself steady, as the train made its way through the crowded underground tunnels. In the midst of this typical scene, there was one commuter who blended into the crowd. He wasn't standing out, wasn't drawing attention to himself. It was Steph Curry, wearing a simple hoodie and jeans. He looked like any other passenger on the train. No flashy clothes, no security detail, just another person riding the subway. He was lost in his own thoughts, staring out the window, relaxing as much as one could in the cramped space of the subway car. He looked just like any other commuter, a quiet figure in a busy crowd. But then, the train jerked suddenly, and the elderly woman lost her balance. Her hands slipped from the rail for a brief moment, and she wobbled, struggling to stay on her feet. It was a quick moment of vulnerability, one that would have gone unnoticed by most of the passengers. But not Steph. His eyes immediately locked on the elderly woman across the aisle. He saw her struggle and without a second thought, he recognized the need to act. Steph Curry had been quietly observing the scene, lost in his own thoughts, but when the elderly woman lost her balance, he couldn't ignore it. The sound of her wobbling, trying to find her footing, snapped him back to reality. Without a moment's hesitation, he stood up, his movement smooth and purposeful. He wasn't looking for attention, and he wasn't trying to make a big scene, it was just the right thing to do. He walked toward her, weaving through the crowded train car. There were no dramatic gestures, no grand speech, just a simple, genuine act of kindness. He reached her side and gently tapped her on the shoulder, letting her know he was there. At first, the elderly woman was taken aback. She looked up, confused for a second, her tired eyes scanning Steph as if she was trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't something she expected in the busy, rushed atmosphere of the subway. Her initial shock quickly gave way to something more, surprise mixed with a bit of disbelief. Here was a young man, someone she could never have imagined would be so kind, offering her something as simple, yet meaningful, as his seat. Steph's calm and humble demeanor only added to the impact. He didn't speak much, but his eyes said everything. His voice was soft, just loud enough for her to hear, as he offered the seat. "Here, please," he said. "You can sit." The woman's face softened as she took in the gesture. Her surprise melted into a warm smile, and for a moment, the crowded subway car seemed to quiet. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she just nodded in gratitude. Her hands, which had been gripping the rail tightly to maintain her balance, relaxed as she slowly sank into the seat Steph had offered. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, but full of emotion. It was a small thank you, but it held a weight that felt bigger than the simple words. She carefully adjusted herself on the seat, grateful for the rest, and as she settled in, her smile grew wider. Around them, the passengers began to notice the interaction. At first, there was just a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as some people glanced up from their phones or books, seeing what had just unfolded. Their faces reflected a mix of curiosity and admiration, as if they were witnessing something rare in the middle of the daily grind of subway life. Some of the commuters had been distracted by their busy lives, their phones, or their work. But now, they were witnessing something that stood out, a simple act of kindness that disrupted the usual indifference that often fills crowded spaces like this. A few of the passengers, who had been absorbed in their own worlds, looked around in surprise. Some of them caught each other's eyes, exchanging quiet glances as if silently acknowledging the warmth of the moment. It wasn't every day that you saw someone give up their seat for someone else, especially in a place like the subway, where people are often more concerned about getting to their destination than noticing the needs of others. One young woman, who had been sitting a few seats away, took her earphones out and looked over at the elderly woman with a slight smile. Her fingers hovered over her phone, ready to snap a picture, but she hesitated. There was something about this moment, something more than just the act of giving up a seat. It was the kindness that seemed to ripple through the space, reminding everyone in the car of the simple humanity we sometimes forget in the rush of our busy lives. The elderly woman, still sitting comfortably in the seat that Steph had offered her, looked up again and met his gaze. Her face was no longer just soft with gratitude, it was filled with something deeper, something that came from a connection. There was a shared understanding in that glance, a moment where two strangers, from completely different walks of life, had exchanged something beautiful: kindness, humility, and respect. Steph Curry, however, didn't wait for praise. He simply smiled at her and returned to his place, standing again, his hand gripping the rail as he continued his ride. He didn't need any recognition. For him, it was just the right thing to do, and that was enough. But for the elderly woman and the other passengers, this simple act of kindness had left a lasting impression. The train, which had felt noisy and crowded just moments ago, seemed to carry a different energy now. There was a quiet warmth that spread throughout the car, as people continued with their commute, but with a little more appreciation for the people around them. Some of the passengers had witnessed something rare, something that made them stop for a second and reflect on how they interacted with the world. As the train sped through the tunnels, the atmosphere in the car was a little lighter, and the small gesture from Steph Curry had made the ride feel just a little bit more human. As the train continued on its route, the atmosphere in the car began to shift. The usual hum of the subway was replaced by a sense of quiet admiration for the simple, yet meaningful, act that had just taken place. Some passengers, who had been engrossed in their own worlds, looked up from their phones or books, exchanging glances. A few of them smiled softly, as if silently agreeing that what they had just witnessed was something rare and beautiful. One young woman, sitting a few rows ahead of Steph and the elderly woman, was the first to break the silence. She had been scrolling through her phone, earbuds in, completely absorbed in her digital world. But when she saw what Steph had done, her eyes widened in surprise. She pulled out one earbud and leaned toward her friend, who was sitting beside her. "Wow, that's unexpected," she whispered, her voice filled with admiration. Her friend, who had also witnessed the moment, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's not something you see every day," she replied. "It's nice to know there are still people like that out there." The two of them exchanged a quick smile, both clearly moved by the gesture. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man, who had been standing near the door, shifted his weight and looked around at the other passengers. He caught the eye of a young man sitting next to him, who had been watching the interaction intently. The middle-aged man gave a small nod, acknowledging the quiet act of kindness. Without saying a word, they both shared an understanding of what had just happened. It was as if the whole train car had momentarily become more connected, united by something simple but profound. The elderly woman, now seated and more at ease, looked up at Steph with gratitude in her eyes. She had settled into the seat, but her hand still gripped her handbag tightly, as if she needed something to anchor herself after the unexpected but much-needed relief. Her eyes met Steph's, and for a moment, she just looked at him, as if she were searching for something in his face. Then, with a soft, almost nostalgic smile, she spoke. "You remind me of someone I once knew," she said, her voice gentle but filled with emotion. There was a wistfulness in her tone, as if the kindness she had just received had reminded her of a time long ago, when she had experienced something similar. Steph paused for a moment, surprised by her words. He didn't say anything immediately, but there was a softness in his eyes that spoke volumes. It wasn't about the seat he had given up, it was about something more. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging the memory that had just been stirred within her. He didn't need to speak to understand the depth of her gratitude. His eyes met hers, and the exchange of smiles between them was enough. As the train continued its journey, the elderly woman settled back into her seat, her face soft with appreciation. The other passengers in the car had begun to return to their own routines, but the atmosphere had undeniably changed. The usual rush and busyness of the subway ride had been replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. Passengers who had been isolated in their own little worlds now found themselves more aware of the people around them. A shared moment of kindness had rippled through the car, softening the edges of the daily grind. Steph, on the other hand, remained humble, as he always did. He wasn't looking for praise or recognition. He didn't need anyone to clap or make a big deal out of the gesture. He had done what he felt was right, and that was enough for him. He didn't make eye contact with the other passengers or try to draw attention to himself. Instead, he stood quietly, his hand gripping the overhead rail as he continued his ride, just like everyone else. His demeanor was calm, unassuming, and humble. He didn't seek out admiration, and that was what made his gesture even more meaningful. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about proving a point. It was simply an act of kindness, born out of empathy and the recognition that sometimes, a small gesture can make all the difference in someone's day. Steph's actions spoke volumes without him ever needing to say a word. The elderly woman, still sitting in the seat, looked around at the other passengers. She caught the eye of a young man who had been standing nearby. He smiled at her, and she smiled back. There was no need for words. The moment had already been shared. The connection had already been made. The train continued to rattle along the tracks, but the mood inside the car had shifted. Passengers who had been absorbed in their phones or books now seemed a little more present, a little more aware of the people around them. Some were still lost in their own thoughts, but others exchanged quiet smiles or nods, as if acknowledging the warmth of the moment that had just unfolded. In the quiet of the subway car, there was a shared understanding among the passengers. A small act of kindness had rippled through the crowd, changing the atmosphere and leaving everyone with a renewed sense of humanity. And as the train neared the next stop, no one seemed in a hurry to move. They lingered, just a little longer than usual, savoring the quiet connection that had been sparked by one simple act of kindness. As the train continued its journey through the bustling city, the elderly woman settled more comfortably into her seat, her hands now resting gently on her lap. She glanced up at Steph, still standing nearby, his humble presence almost blending in with the quiet atmosphere around them. With a soft smile, she started speaking again, her voice quieter this time, as though she were opening up about something that had been in her heart for a long time. "You remind me of someone I once knew," she said, her tone filled with nostalgia. "A long time ago, there was a man who would always do small things for me, things that no one else noticed. It wasn't much, but it meant the world to me. It's funny, how sometimes those little gestures stay with you far longer than the big ones. He would always give me his seat on the bus, just like you did today." She paused, her eyes staring ahead as if lost in the memory. "Back then, I was too proud to ask for help, but that small act, giving up his seat, meant more to me than I could ever explain." Steph listened quietly, his gaze fixed on her, absorbing her words without interruption. There was something so genuine in her voice, something that made him realize the power of even the smallest gestures. He could see that the memory was important to her, that the kindness of the past had shaped who she was now. He nodded, not needing to say much. "I'm happy to help," he replied simply, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. As the woman continued, other passengers began to listen in. A young man across the aisle, who had been quietly observing the conversation, leaned forward slightly. He had been scrolling through his phone, but the story caught his attention. "You know, I've seen something like that," he said, his voice hesitant at first. "Not the exact thing, but the idea. My mom, she always helped people, always gave up her seat for others when she could. She taught me that little things, like giving someone a seat, can mean the world. It stuck with me. Now, I try to do the same when I can." His words were simple, but there was a depth to them, and the sincerity in his voice made it clear that his mother's lessons had impacted him deeply. Others in the train car, too, began to listen. A middle-aged woman sitting near the door put down her book and glanced toward the conversation. "My father used to tell me that kindness was the key to everything," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He always said, if you're kind to others, they'll remember it long after the action is over." He was right. I can still remember the little things he did for people when I was growing up. He taught me that kindness never goes unnoticed, even if it's just a smile or helping someone with their bags. The atmosphere in the subway car had completely shifted. The usual busy, indifferent hum of the train had faded, replaced by a collective sense of warmth and reflection. What started as a simple act, Steph offering his seat to an elderly woman, had sparked something much deeper. It wasn't just about a seat on the train anymore, it was about the power of small gestures, the ripple effect of kindness, and how these acts could shape lives in ways people often didn't realize. Steph, still standing near the elderly woman, felt the weight of the moment. He had no idea that his simple act would resonate so deeply, not just with the woman but with the other passengers around him. It was a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, had the power to change the mood of an entire room, or in this case, an entire subway car. As the train continued along its path, the passengers began to settle into a quieter, more thoughtful rhythm. The conversation shifted from small talk to deeper reflections about kindness, family, and respect. For some, it was the first time in a while they had thought about how much small gestures mattered. For others, it was a reaffirmation of lessons they had learned long ago. Either way, the ripple effect of Steph's kindness had transformed the atmosphere inside the subway car, turning it into a space filled with shared humanity, respect, and understanding. As the elderly woman finished sharing her story, there was a soft pause in the train car. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. Steph, still standing nearby, took a deep breath and reflected on what she had said. He had always known that kindness mattered, but hearing the woman's story made him realize just how far even the smallest gestures could go. "You never know what someone's going through," Steph said, his voice thoughtful but steady. "We all just need to be a little kinder to each other." His words were simple but powerful, and they resonated with everyone around him. The elderly woman, still sitting in the seat Steph had given her, looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. She smiled softly, touched by both his action and his reflection. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You're right." A middle-aged man sitting a few rows away, who had been listening intently to the conversation, nodded thoughtfully. "I've been in a rush my whole life," he said, his tone reflective. "Always trying to get ahead, get things done. I think I'll start taking a moment, thinking twice before rushing past someone in need. You never know what someone's dealing with." The mood in the train had shifted. What had started as a simple exchange between two people had sparked something deeper. Passengers, once absorbed in their own worlds, were now quietly looking at each other with a sense of connection, as if they all shared a moment of understanding. They weren't just strangers on a train anymore. They were people who had just witnessed an act of kindness and, in turn, had been reminded of how such moments could change lives. As the train approached the next stop, the elderly woman slowly stood up, gripping her handbag with one hand and the rail with the other. She looked at Steph once more, a genuine smile crossing her face. "Thank you again," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. Steph nodded, his own smile reflecting the quiet understanding between them. "Take care," he said, offering her a small but meaningful gesture of farewell. As the elderly woman exited the train, the atmosphere inside the subway car remained unchanged, yet subtly different. There was a sense of connection that lingered, a shared moment of kindness that had brought everyone together, even if just for a brief moment. The passengers, once strangers, now held a deeper awareness of each other, a reminder of the power of kindness that had spread throughout the car. The train resumed its journey, its familiar hum returning, but the quiet sense of connection remained, a reminder that even in the rush of everyday life, small acts of kindness can make all the difference. As the train carried on, the atmosphere remained charged with an unspoken understanding, a collective recognition of how one simple act of kindness could ripple out, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. The elderly woman's gratitude, Steph's humble gesture, and the quiet reflection from the passengers all reminded them of something simple but profound: small acts of kindness truly can make a big difference. We often rush through life, absorbed in our own world, unaware of the struggles others may be facing. But it's moments like this that show us how something as small as offering a seat can have a lasting impact, not just on the person directly involved, but on everyone who witnesses it. One act of kindness has the power to shift the atmosphere, create connections, and inspire others to reflect on their own actions. As you watch this story, take a moment to reflect on how you can incorporate kindness into your own life. Whether it's holding the door open for someone, offering a helping hand, or simply being present for someone in need, small gestures can create meaningful change. Ask yourself, when was the last time you took a moment to show kindness to someone around you? Kindness is contagious. It spreads, quietly but powerfully, from one person to another, creating a chain of goodwill that can change the world, one small act at a time. We can all make a difference, no matter how big or small, and by choosing kindness, we not only impact others but also inspire positivity in our communities. So, the next time you're out and about, remember the power of kindness. Let's make the world a better place, one small gesture at a time. Share this story with others, and let's spread kindness far and wide.